Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, DNFBP. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, DNFBPs Annual AML Return Review. My name is Colin Wu, and I'm the Section Head of Monitoring in the Monitoring and Enforcement Division in the Registration Authority. Presenting this webinar today will be myself and two colleagues from the Registration Authority, Saad Shah, Monitoring Specialist, and Natella Ali, Executive Director, Registration and Incorporation. Also participating in today's webinar from the Financial Services Regulatory Authority is Michael Lata, Senior Manager from the Financial Crime Prevention Unit. This webinar is a presentation of our review of the annual AML returns that were required to be filed on 30 April 2020 by firms that are designated non-financial business or profession, also known as a DNFBP. DNFBPs are the non-financial services businesses that are required to comply with ADGM AML rules and federal law on anti-money laundering, AML. By conducting this webinar, we hope to raise awareness of DNFBP AML obligations and the common issues that we found after our review of the annual AML returns submitted by DNFBPs. Next slide, please. Okay, previous slide, please. The agenda for today's webinar is listed on this slide. I will be covering the topics 1 and 2 on the agenda and recap on who are the authorities in ADGM who are responsible for AML supervision of businesses. I will then hand over to Saad, who will focus on the annual AML returns and our review of those returns, items 3 to 7 on the agenda. Finally, Natella will cover requirements for the appointment of money laundering reporting officers, or MLROs, in topic 8. You're all welcome to post questions in the chat box throughout the session. We will then answer these at the end of this presentation at the Q&A session. Please note that copies of this presentation will be made available at a later date. Next slide, please. There are 3 authorities in ADGM, the ADGM courts, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority, the FSRA, and the Registration Authority. The FSRA is the authority responsible for ensuring compliance with AML legislation, spearheaded by the Specialist Financial Crime Prevention Unit, or FCPU. The Registration Authority is responsible for, amongst other things, the registration and incorporation of firms in the centre, and the monitoring of all firms for compliance with ADGM commercial legislation. Under the Financial Services and Markets Regulations 2015, the FSRA is empowered to make rules in connection with the creation and implementation of AML measures, policies and procedures, including rules, and has the power to supervise compliance in ADGM with relevant AML law in the UAE. On 15 April 2019, the FSRA delegated the AML supervision of DNFBPs to the Registration Authority. Next slide. So, in summary, the supervision of ADGM firms for compliance with AML requirements is shared between the two authorities. The FSRA, who supervises financial services firms, and the Registration Authority, who monitor non-financial services firms. Next slide, please. This slide shows the relationship between the Financial Crime Prevention Unit at the FSRA and the Monitoring and Enforcement Division at the Registration Authority. The FCPU's role and responsibilities are developing sound practices in AML and CFT compliance, taking the lead in AML CFT supervision, raising awareness on AML CFT requirements, tax reporting requirements, and sanctions compliance. As stated before, the Monitoring and Enforcement Division at the Registration Authority is responsible for monitoring all ADGM persons for compliance with ADGM commercial legislation, including but not limited to the Companies Regulations 2020, Commercial Licensing Regulations 2015, and the Beneficial Ownership and Control Regulations 2018. In addition, the Monitoring and Enforcement Division monitors DNFBP's compliance with ADGM AML rules and is also involved in raising AML awareness with DNFBPs in ADGM. Under the delegation from the FSRA, the Registration Authority is responsible for monitoring DNFBPs for compliance with ADGM AML rules. As a quick recap, DNFBPs include 1, real estate agency, which carries out transactions with other persons that involve the acquiring or disposing of real property. 2, a dealer in precious metals or precious stones. 3, a dealer in any saleable item of a price equal to or greater than $15,000 US. 4, an accounting firm, audit firm, insolvency firm, or taxation consulting firm. 5, a law firm, notary firm, or other independent legal business. Or 6, a company service provider. The Registration Authority reviews and assesses applications for registration of all DNFBPs. The Registration Authority is the main point of contact for DNFBPs in their dealings with ADGM. It performs monitoring on DNFBPs and not-for-profit organizations. Monitoring includes conducting on-site assessments of DNFBPs for compliance with ADGM AML rules. I will now hand over to Said, who will cover Annual AML Returns and who was a key member of the Monitoring Enforcement Division who conducted a review of those returns.
Thanks, Colin. By way of introduction, my name is Saad, and I'm a specialist within the Monitoring and Enforcement Division in the Registration Authority. The AML return is a requirement under Rule 4.6 of the ADGM AML rules, which requires all ADGM authorized firms and DNFBPs to file an annual AML return to the regulator. As previously discussed by Colin, the FSRA has delegated the supervision of DNFBPs to the Registration Authority. Supervision of DNFBPs includes reviewing AML returns. In today's session, we will be highlighting the common findings that were identified by the Monitoring and Enforcement Division during the review of the DNFBP's Annual AML Return of 2019. The Annual AML Return provides a high-level overview of DNFBP compliance with the ADGM AML rules, including the systems and controls in place. The 2019 AML Return, which was due by 30th of April 2020, covered the reporting period of 1st of January 2019 to 31st of December 2019. DNFBPs incorporated or registered post 31st of October were exempted from filing the return for the 2019 reporting period. The next annual AML return submission for the reporting period of 1st of January 2020 to 31st of December 2020 is due by 30th of April 21. Next slide, please. As you can see on the timeline, on 15th of April 2019, the FSRA delegated the supervision of DNFBPs to the Registration Authority's Monitoring and Enforcement Division. On 9th of April 2020, the Monitoring and Enforcement Division sent the first reminder to all ADGM registered DNFBPs that were required to submit the AML return by 30th of April 2020. On 20th of April 2020, the Monitoring and Enforcement Division sent a second reminder to all ADGM registered DNFBPs that were required to file by 30th of April 2020. The initial deadline for filing was 30th of April 2020, which was later on extended until 31st of May 2020 due to COVID-19. On 30th of June, the Monitoring and Enforcement Division concluded the review and assessment of all submitted AML returns. Next slide, please. Overall, the Monitoring and Enforcement Division received 89% of the required AML returns. The AML returns were submitted were assessed based on three criteria as follows. The first criteria is related to the timing of submission. This refers to submissions received on or before 30th of April or in accordance with the 31st of May extension granted. Filings received post 31st of May did not satisfy the criteria. The second criteria is related to the adequacy of responses provided. This refers to an assessment of the responses provided in the AML return and whether they provide a detailed and adequate explanation of the AML policies and procedures of the firm. For example, some DNFBPs only provided a summary of their onboarding procedure with no details of how risk assessment, KYC, or due diligence is conducted within the firm. The third and last criteria is related to the assessment of controls in place. This criteria consisted of assessing the responses received against the requirements set out in the ADGM AML rules. For example, some responses received lacked procedures on enhanced due diligence, such as when and how to conduct EDD on a client. As is shown on the graph, 99% of the submissions received have met the first criteria. On the second bar, you can see that 80% of the filed AML returns provided detailed responses in their submissions. Lastly, the third bar shows that 72% of the submissions received appear to cover the requirements set out in the ADGM AML rules. For your information, DNFBPs are required to comply with Rule 1 to 9 and 11 to 15 of the AML rules. Next slide, please. In this slide, we'll be discussing the common findings that have been identified by the Monitoring and Enforcement Division. First common finding is related to sanction screening. Second finding is related to completing the GoAML registration. Third finding is related to implementation of the National Risk Assessment when conducting the firm business risk assessment. Fourth finding is related to the semi-annual AML return. Lastly, the fifth finding relates to the appointment of a deputy MLRO. We will be going into details of each one in the next slides. Next slide, please. Sanction screening. As we all know, sanction screening is a requirement under Rule 11.1 of the ADGM AML rules, which requires ADGM registered DNFBPs to establish and maintain effective systems and controls to ensure ongoing monitoring of sanctions. Also, as you may be aware, the federal laws and cabinet resolutions apply in financial free zones. In 2019, the UAE has issued Cabinet Resolution number 20 of 2019 in relation to sanctions. Article 19 of the same resolution requires financial institutions and DNFBPs to conduct their screening on a daily basis. Recently, the UAE has issued Cabinet Resolution number 74 of 2020, which repealed the Cabinet Resolution number 20 of 2019. This resolution was circulated by FCPU on the 10th of November of 2020 to all registered DNFBPs and financial institutions. The newly enacted Cabinet Resolution includes definitions and further clarifications on the role of the Supreme Council for National Security, as well as supervisory authorities, law enforcement agencies, and the obligations of financial institutions and DNFBPs in terms of how to deal with the list of the Security Council sanctions and domestic terrorism list. The updated Cabinet Resolution is also available on FCPU's webpage. Finally, as we all know, the UAE has undergone a FATF mutual assessment, and sanction screening was identified as a deficiency. In summary, ADGM expects all ADGM registered DNFBPs to maintain adequate systems and controls in place to ensure proper sanctions monitoring. For example, during the review of the Annual AML Return conducted by the Monitoring and Enforcement Division, we have noted that some firms conducted sanction screening at the onboarding stage or only once every 6 months. However, the requirement of sanction screening is identified under the Cabinet Resolution to be daily. Next slide, please. The Go AML system registration. As you are aware, one of the MLRO responsibilities is to report suspicious activity reports to the Financial Intelligence Unit. The Financial Intelligence Unit sits within the Central Bank of UAE. To give you a bit of background, in 2018, the UAE became the first GCC country to adopt the Go AML system for reporting suspicious activity reports. In 2019, the UAE went live with the Go AML system. The Go AML system is owned by the Central Bank of UAE. Since then, the Registration Authority has been sending reminders to all ADGM registered DNFBPs in order to complete their Go AML registration. The Go AML system registration is inclusive of two parts. First part, which is the pre-registration, and second part, which is the authorization. The first part requires the appointed MLRO to upload all required documents and to be registered as the responsible person for reporting suspicious activity reports to the FIU. Part 1 provides access to the system and is approved by the Go AML system, by the Go AML team in the Central Bank of UAE. Hence, whenever you faced any technical issues, we were referring you to the Go AML team in the Central Bank of UAE. Part 2 is the authorization of the relevant DNFBP for the use of system, and this is done by the regulator. In this case, for ADGM registered DNFBPs, it would be the Financial Crime Prevention Unit. It was noted during the review of the AML return that a number of DNFBPs have failed to complete their Go AML registration. Failure to complete the Go AML registration means that the DNFBP is unable to file any suspicious activity reports to the FIU, and is therefore considered a contravention of the ADGM AML rules as well as the applicable federal AML laws. Next slide, please. Third finding, the National Risk Assessment. What is the National Risk Assessment Committee? The National Risk Assessment Committee was established by His Highness the Ministry of Interior to assess risks on a national level as well as to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. Some of the objectives of the UAE National Risk Assessment Committee is To prepare and develop a national strategy to combat crime and propose related regulations, policies, and procedures in coordination with the competent authorities. To determine and assess the risk of the crime on a national level. Facilitate the exchange of information and coordination among various bodies represented in the committee. Last but not least, propose the implementation of regulations covering the work of the committee. The UAE has issued the first National Risk Assessment Report in 2019. The purpose of the report is to align the financial crime framework across UAE by highlighting potential risks at a national level. The report highlighted risks for onshore, financial free zones, and commercial free zones. As you've seen in the AML return, Section 1.5 requests confirmation on whether the relevant firm has conducted a business risk assessment or not. If so, when conducting the business risk assessment, the firm should take into consideration the national risk assessment findings. Based on the review of the AML return, many firms have failed to take into consideration the results of the national risk assessment findings. For example, the national risk assessment finding has risk-assessed firms' legal structures. According to the NRA, a firm with a legal structure of a private company limited by share poses a higher risk than a firm with a legal structure of a limited partnership. Such examples should be fed into the DNFBP's business risk assessment. Overall, ADGM expects all its registered DNFBPs to take into consideration the UAE National Risk Assessment findings when conducting their business risk assessment. Next slide, please. This fourth finding is related to the semi-annual AML return. We do understand that there is a confusion in the semi-annual return and the annual AML return. The semi-annual return is a different requirement from the annual AML return. It is a report that must be submitted by the MLRO to the governing body or senior management of the firm on the results of the review of effectiveness of the firm's AML policies, procedures, systems, and controls, as well as the firm's compliance with the federal AML laws, as well as the ADGM AML rules. Rule 12.4.1 of the AML rules requires all ADGM registered DNFBPs to submit a semi-annual return. This rule is derived from the Cabinet Resolution number 10 of 2019 to satisfy the requirements under Section 8 of Article 21 of Part 3. There is no set format for the semi-annual return except that it must cover the requirements set out in Rule 12.4.2 of the AML rules. Based on the review of the annual AML return and internal statistics, a high number of DNFBPs have failed to submit a copy of the semi-annual return to the regulator. The ADGM expects that all ADGM registered DNFBPs to complete and submit a copy of the semi-annual return to the regulator. Next slide, please. Fifth finding was related to appointment of a deputy MLRO. During the review of the annual AML return, it was noted that most ADGM registered DNFBPs have failed to appoint a deputy MLRO. The purpose of the deputy MLRO is to act as the MLRO in the absence of the MLRO. The deputy MLRO must be able to take over all the MLRO responsibilities as prescribed in Rule 12.1.5 of the ADGM AML rules. Furthermore, the appointment of a deputy MLRO is internal and does not require prior approval from the registration authority. Next slide, please. On my last slide, before I hand over to Natella, I will be highlighting ADGM initiatives and supporting ADGM registered DNFBPs. First initiative was related to awareness sessions and webinars. As part of the ADGM initiatives to support its ADGM registered DNFBPs, the Financial Crime Prevention Unit, in collaboration with the Monitoring and Enforcement Division, have been hosting outreach sessions before COVID-19. And going forward, we'll be holding a webinar ahead of the next submission of the annual AML return, which is due by April 2021. On another note, the RA, in collaboration with the FSRA, have set a compliance networking group, which you all have received an invite to attend. We have sent this invite to all ADGM registered DNFBPs to participate in the compliance networking group. Next, we'll be having my colleague Natella from the Registration and Corporation team, who will take you through the process and requirements for appointments of MLROs.
Thank you, Syed, and good afternoon, everyone. I will provide you with the overview of the requirements for appointment of MLRO and the qualities of MLRO. Now, the appointment of MLRO requirements are listed in section 12.1 of the AML rulebook. Every DNFBP must appoint an individual as the MLRO who has an appropriate level of seniority, experience, and independence. These are the requirements in order to enable the MLRO to fulfill his role and function and responsibility, which revolves all around the implementation and oversight of the compliance with AML rulebook. Now, the MLRO to be appointed must be a resident in UAE. MLRO function is mandatory appointment for DNFBPs. If MLRO leaves the employment of the firm, the DNFBP must immediately appoint a new MLRO or arrange a temporary cover for the MLRO appointment. Syed mentioned earlier that 12.15 of the AML rulebook requires that the DNFBP appoints a deputy MLRO, and that's where deputy MLRO would come handy. Having said that, you don't need to notify the registrar of the appointment of deputy MLRO, but it is your responsibility to appoint one. Now, the DNFBP must promptly notify a registrar of the new MLRO appointment. We do have that function in our online registry solution. Sometimes MLRO changes its details, such as service address, contact details. You could use our online registry solution to amend those details too. That's a separate function. Now, on to the qualities of MLRO. This is prescribed in section 12.2 of the AML rulebook. As I said earlier, MLRO must be UAE resident. It must be a fit and proper person. You cannot be sanctioned or disqualified or undischarged bankrupt. You have to meet the fitness and proprietary test. Now, any appointed MLRO must have direct access to the senior management within the firm. And he must have sufficient resources, which includes an appropriate number of appropriately trained employees to assist the MLRO to perform his duties in effective, objective, and independent manner. Seniority and independence is very important for MLRO. MLRO must have the level of seniority and independence within the DNFBP so that he or she can act in his own authority. Now, MLRO can be outsourced to a professional firm. However, when you appoint an outsourced MLRO, you have to ensure that that outsourced MLRO will have actual and effective level of seniority that the MLRO role requires. Now, we derive the qualities of MLRO from the online application form that we review and supporting documents. So please pay attention to the questions, the answer that you provide in the online application form. And it's very important that you provide a very detailed CV, because we do pay a lot of attention to your previous experience and immediate experience before the appointment. And we also pay a lot of attention to your educational qualifications and any AML related qualifications that you obtained so far, whether it's ICA AML course or CAMS or ACAMS qualification or exams. Please pay attention to what you provide in the supporting documents. It matters. Very often I see the description on the application form of the current roles and responsibilities is reference to the CV, but it would help if you provide a lot of details in the application form in relation to your current roles and responsibilities, specifically as MLRO. We, of course, review all the other parts of your CV, but it's very important what is it that you do right now or immediately prior to appointment as MLRO. Now, the online solution has the function to appoint the first MLRO and then to provide details of cessation of the current MLRO and appointment of the next MLRO. The online registry solution is accessible 24/7. You can provide additional supporting documents, whatever you think would help us to review the details of the candidate and to make an assessment of whether or not that candidate meets the requirements that are listed in 12.1 and especially 12.2 of the AML rulebook. On that note, I'm going to pass it on to the next section of this presentation, which is Q&A.
Testing, testing. Hello. And now it's working. Welcome back, everyone, to the Q&A session. Apologies for the minor technical difficulties we're experiencing with the sound, but hopefully you can hear us now. So yes, this is the part of the session where we invite everyone who is attending the webinar to send your questions through in the comments section, in the box on your computers. It can be on any of the topics raised by any of the presenters during this webinar. We'll do our best to answer them. It can be anything in relation to matter Saad raised, in relation to the AML annual returns that were submitted, or perhaps you might have a question for Nutella in relation to the appointment of MLROs. And of course, we have Michael Lata here from the FSRA who might be able to assist as well. We don't have any questions at the moment, but we certainly invite you to do so.
Seems like you've done a really good job.
Thanks you, Michael. Anyway, we'll just give it a few minutes.
Everyone read rulebook really well. Right? I think we have a question.
While we're waiting for some questions, maybe I can just ask, or just to remind the audience that we would like them to actively subscribe to the Executive Office for download on sanctions. Updates on sanctions is very important, and they should keep their databases up to date and check on a regular basis as per the requirements of the Cabinet Resolution number 74. The second point I'd also like to just remind everybody again is also please make sure that you have registered for the Go AML, because This is now becoming a critical issue. If you fail to register in a timely basis, that matter will be escalated to our senior management for further action.
We've got a question.
Thank you, Michael. I think there was just one question. Does the appointment of a deputy MLRO require prior approval from the RA? So that would be Saad. I think Nutella also touched on that.
Yes, I touched upon the appointment of deputy MLRO, which is compulsory. But there is no requirement under the rule book to notify the registrar of who is the deputy MLRO. So the firm should keep the record and should definitely have, it says it's a must, appointment is a must for deputy MLRO. But there is no obligation to report to the registrar who that MLRO, deputy MLRO is.
Excellent. Thank you, Nutella. Oh, we have a couple of more questions coming through. Great.
Colin,
Okay,
would you like to answer the question regarding the semi-annual return?
Yes. Sorry? Okay. We have a question here. Does the FSRA plan to provide guidance or format on the semi-annual return? I believe Saad might be able to assist there. Hand it over to Saad.
Hello? Thank you. So we have issued guidance last submission. So last year we have issued guidance on how to submit your annual AML return, and this year we'll be issuing another guidance for submissions of DNFBPs annual AML return. I'm not sure if Mike, you have anything to add to this, but.
Okay, I understand the question was to provide guidance or format on the semi-annual return, which is a requirement under the Cabinet resolution. No, there is not. In actual fact, we've avoided doing so. The Cabinet resolution does not specifically state exactly what should be in that report. It's a free format report, but you should be highlighting the risk that you believe your company is facing on a semi-annual basis. That report should be submitted to the senior management, and a copy should then be sent to the regulator for them to review to ensure that you are addressing or mitigating any possible risks that may be coming up.
Okay, there was a question about where the attendees can watch this webinar after the webinar, whether it will be recorded and posted somewhere. I understand there's a page. If you search for ADGM webinars, they're all kept in there.
Okay, and the other question that came up is mandatory to file AML STR. Yes, it is. It is mandatory. And failure to do so can result in possible enforcement action.
Okay, over to you, Saad. We'll leave it closed.
Thank you everyone for your attendance, and we hope you had a good session. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us through monitoring@adgm.com or at fcpu@adgm.com. The session will be available on ADGM website, and we hope to see you soon again. Thank you.